The impossible dream of China's pro-democracy students becomes a nightmare of brutality and death. The protest around Beijing's Tiananmen Square crushed in an onslaught of troops and tanks and armored personnel carriers. The dead and wounded, impossible to count for sure, in the hundreds, perhaps the thousands. And yet people power in the People's Republic refuses to die.
Who told you to place a tap at this house?
Jim West, Cincinnati Bell Security.
This house was the home of federal judge Vincent Ogg Jr.
Who would want to tap your phone?
There was valuable, sensitive information floating around.
Valuable to?
To litigants, to criminals, and perhaps to law enforcement officers themselves.
To the police?
Yes.
If I read about this in the newspaper going on in New York City or Los Angeles, I wouldn't think too much about it. But these things just aren't done in Cincinnati.
I'm Mike Wallace.
I'm Morley Safer.
I'm Harry Reisner.
I'm Ed Bradley. Those stories and Andy Rooney tonight on 60 Minutes.
Oh, a new day in Beijing. But the darkest hours of China's pro-democracy protest continue. Tens of thousands of troops patrol the city in the wake of a bloodbath that will either end the uprising or spark a new movement among the stunned Chinese people. The invasion of Tiananmen Square was reportedly ordered by China's aging leader Deng Xiaoping from the hospital bed where he is being treated for cancer. Our old 60 Minutes colleague Dan Rather joins us now for more on this extraordinary and still developing story.
Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everyone. Monday morning, Beijing, China, and the Chinese capital is a brooding, tense, angry place. Its people still trying to absorb the terrible reality of what has happened there. Hundreds of tanks now patrol streets that for weeks have been overflowing with demonstrators for freedom and their supporters. Amidst eerie calm many places, reports continue of scattered clashes and gunfire as citizens try to use paving stones and firebombs against the tanks and troops. It took the People's Liberation Army 7 hours to capture Tiananmen Square from the democracy and freedom movement, and estimates of the dead range from several hundred to several thousand. The Army has removed and cremated many bodies, but nothing can conceal the awful truth. There has been mass death. Students at Beijing's universities are bracing now for a new assault, but so far that hasn't happened. Our resident China correspondent John Sheehan has been up around the clock throughout the government's bloody assault on people power, and he's with us now live from Beijing. Jack, is the government firmly in charge again, or can we expect more confrontations and violence?
Well, the government isn't quite in charge. There are more tanks right now, more of an armored force in the center of the city than is needed to control that area. The big fear is that another attack force is massing. People have been burning army vehicles. They've been setting up barricades, and in some cases they've been attacking soldiers with rocks or fists. And of course the big danger is the anger, the rage on the university campuses, that the students might again try to demonstrate and get shot down in the streets. One Western intelligence source calls the campuses a time bomb just waiting to go off, Dan.
Jack, why now? Why this particular weekend?
Well, the Army is clearly extending martial law in a very, very logical way, and according to the Book of the Iron Fist, they are controlling major highways. They're going to set up roadblocks now. We've seen the first ones go up, and very shortly we can expect them to start to limit the number of people permitted to gather in any one place. Dan?
John Sheehan, thanks. Over the past few weeks, China's pro-democracy students and their millions of supporters captured the world's attention, and the Chinese government seemed unwilling or unable to quell the growing movement. For a while, it looked like they were going to restrain themselves and try to outwait it. Even as this weekend began, there was tension around Tiananmen Square, but few hints of the tragedy to come. What a difference the next hours would make. Outside Tiananmen Square, soldiers confronted the demonstrators. It was a standoff. Elsewhere, troop convoys moved closer to the center of the city. only to be held back by student demonstrators and their supporters. There were scattered incidents outside the square. The delicate balance was breaking down. At the government headquarters, the face-off turned violent, and demonstrators broke through the gates of the Great Hall. The students held the soldiers off, halting troop convoys that had been brought as reinforcement. A standoff that endured for the next several hours. On national television, a warning to stay away from the square and to abide by martial law. But the violence escalated as troops pressed their way toward the square, met by rock-throwing demonstrators who managed to capture several armored vehicles. Canisters of tear gas were fired by Chinese soldiers.
There are reports of gunfire near the military museum about 5 miles from Tiananmen Square, and just about half a mile from there to the north and west. We've been hearing practically non-stop automatic weapons fire.
And by midnight, armored vehicles finally broke through the barriers set up by the students. In the early hours of Sunday, troops stormed the square in force and opened fire. Tanks crossed into the square itself. Fighting continued, and the unarmed demonstrators resisted.
And the people are chanting, "Don't shoot the people, don't shoot the people."
By 3:30 Sunday morning, soldiers had taken over. Gunfire was heard throughout the city. And casualties mounted. Shortly after 5 a.m., CBS News correspondent Richard Roth and CBS News cameraman Derek Williams, reporting from the square, were dragged away by the military. Their capture could be heard on the air over Roth's cellular telephone.
You hear that gunfire?
Fire, we do hear it.
Okay, we've got to get out of here. They're after Derek now. They're ripping away his camera. They're ripping away his camera, and they're coming for us. We're trying to move back and move away. Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no.
Only by daylight could the enormity of the tragedy be assessed, with some estimates of the dead running into the thousands. At the University of Politics and Law, a vigil was held to mourn the dead. Running out of space, hospitals put wounded on the floor. The military said thousands of their own were injured. Some soldiers burned, one hung and burned by angry protesters after his tank mowed down 4 civilians. By 9 a.m. today, miraculously, the streets were filled again Shocked residents stood in silent rage, building a human wall in the face of a column of tanks. Throughout the city, supporters of the demonstrators, the supporters of the movement, told their story. These young Chinese revealed the corpse of a 9-year-old, evidence of the brutality of these last 36 hours. In a day of seemingly unrelenting grimness about China, there was one piece of welcome news, word that our CBS News colleagues, Richard Roth and Derek Williams, two of the world's most experienced broadcast journalists in foreign reporting, had made their way safely to a Beijing hotel. Roth showing the effects of a roughing up by the Chinese troops who took the men into custody some 19 hours earlier. Correspondent Roth joins us now from Beijing. Richard, what was the scene in the square as those troops moved in?
Dan, it had been approaching chaos. Derek and I were moving across the square as some tracer bullets were being fired into the air. It was clearly a move that was preparatory to an attack or an assault, and we'd been trying to find a position where we could achieve some relative degree of safety and still watch the events unfold before us. We finally found a corner where we thought we could do that, and we moved to it when the police, or the troops rather, came up to us and began pulling us down from a fence. They pulled us down from a fence, dragged us away, and took us to the south portico of the Great Hall of the People, where the troops had been stationed, or at least most of them had been stationed there. And we could only listen to what went on inside Tiananmen Square itself. We could not see it. What we heard was extraordinary gunfire, and then silence. After the assault was complete, it was early dawn then. The sky was gray and suffused with some smoke from the gunfire and the mounds of debris that had been set on fire by the demonstrators. We were driven in a pair of jeeps through the square toward the Forbidden City. What I recall at the time was there was no odor of tear gas. None had been used, and I wondered why not. All the firepower that had been used was lethal firepower. There were several thousand troops sitting on the pavement, cross-legged. Most were carrying assault rifles, but many also had thick wooden sticks. And many of the troops saluted the officer commanding the jeep that I was in. There was a lot of brief, shouted, "Good cheer." I don't know what the words I heard meant, but the way they were delivered sounded like, "Good job, well done." And it was all very efficient. And we swept through the square past some light tanks, some armored personnel carriers, some artillery pieces, and into the walled Forbidden City, or at least into the park just inside the gate. And that has been turned into an army garrison. There were 3 of us at that time, Derek Williams, myself, and a young woman who had been captured by troops at the same time. And she was an American student here. We were all led into the garrison, into a classroom 10 feet by 10 feet, where we stayed for essentially 19 hours.
Richard Roth, good to have you back and free. As the student loudspeakers were being torn down in Tiananmen Square, among the last things the students said were, "Chinese people don't kill other Chinese people." They were wrong. China expert and novelist Betty Bao Lord has been helping us try to understand and report on the events of these past few weeks, events that could change China forever, and she joins us now from Washington. Betty, the rank-and-file Chinese citizen, what is likely to be going through his and her minds?
Anger. The utter feeling of how could it have this happened to children, to people that put the Communist Party in power. How could they misuse their trust this way?
Betty, do you think that the army invasion took the people of Beijing by surprise, or were they kind of expecting it, given the Maoist, Stalinist background of the regime?
I think both things happened at once. Like so many things in China, it's contradictory. On the one hand, I think there were a lot of people who felt they would never come in. And then there were others hoping against hope that only with the spilling of blood could they bridge this crisis to give them an opportunity to perhaps put forward faster the movement for democracy. Both sides I've heard before, but I don't think anyone would have guessed that they would have been so brutal, because the students really didn't have anything. They just had bare hands.
And it appeared that the regime was going to try to wait them out, and indeed they seemed right on the cusp of successfully waiting them out.
Yes, I don't know what happened to make them do this. I thought when I left Beijing on Tuesday that it was going to be just a stalemate, and that the students were already beginning to leave the campus, the square. So it seemed like to me a waiting game. The government would eventually have the square, but somebody must have thought they had to show the power.
And what happened to the theory, which proved to be dead wrong, that they need Western capital, they need more Western investment, and they would never do this sort of thing?
Oh, they need it. Definitely they need it. But on the other hand, if they wanted to show of power, this was number 2 to their number 1 choice, which is to have control. And by the brutality that we have just seen, I think they want to scare and intimidate them. Either that or the Politburo people and the people in power are getting more and more scared of their own people.
Betty Ballard, thank you. Influential voices on Capitol Hill now are urging President Bush to halt military sales and some technology transfers to China in response to the Iron Fist crackdown. Late today, President Bush returned to Washington from his vacation in Kennebunkport, Maine. CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stoll is at the White House now. Leslie, how far is President Bush likely to go to show his disapproval?
Well, personally, President Bush returned, as you said, from Kennebunkport today with no comment at all on the situation in China. His aide saying that he doesn't want to act precipitously. You can be sure, Dan, that George Bush himself will be directing the course of our U.S. policy toward China, given the fact that he was our U.S. envoy there in the mid-'70s. What we're seeing is his natural inclination to be, as he himself says, cautious and prudent. And one official said that he will find it difficult to throw away 17 years of careful diplomacy because of one weekend. At the same time, Dan, I'm told that China experts at the State Department are working right now on options, and that a cutoff of military sales to China could be announced as soon as tomorrow. We're talking about $700 million worth of sales, including an upgrade of their F-8 fighter plane, and I'm told modernizing their artillery manufacturing facilities. We also sell high-tech computers for the military, and sales of those may be cut off as well, as I say, as soon as tomorrow. The president will meet with congressional leaders in the morning. He'll come under pressure to do more. He'll come under pressure to make some more dramatic statements than he's made so far. He's really said very little.
Is there concern, or has it passed, that President Bush appears, whatever the reality, to some people is coming across with too little, too late, and too timid?
Well, no, I think that tomorrow morning, when these there'll be bipartisan leaders on foreign policy, I think he'll come under a lot of pressure directly. He did today on television from the conservative right, which this administration is always concerned about, as well as the liberal left, urging him to speak out on behalf of the American people, to condemn, abhor, use much firmer and more emotional language to express the way we all feel about what we're watching on television.
Leslie Stoll at the White House, thank you. Now, a short while ago, I talked with China scholar Dr. Harry Harding of the Brookings Institution about what happened in Beijing this weekend and what may be happening next, what we could expect. Doctor, the government seemed to be set on a course of outweighting the students, showing restraint and patience, then something snapped. What happened? Was it a case of they miscalculated the resistance?
I'm not really sure what happened, Dan. There are rumors that the Central Committee of the party is planning to hold a plenary session very soon to unveil and to rubber stamp whatever personnel changes have come from all of this, and that the authorities wanted to clear the demonstrators out of the square, away from the Great Hall of the People, so that that meeting could take place in a semblance of national unity.
Does the Army stay loyal to the present regime in light of what's happened in Beijing?
I think that is still a very serious question. I would not easily forecast divisions within the Army and civil war. There is the possibility, however, that the Army might now resist even more fully further use of armed force, deadly force against demonstrators in the future. That's a possibility.
Doctor, as you know only too well, China is a word-of-mouth society. Rumors and all kinds of reports float around about Deng Xiaoping. One is that he's issued these orders from a hospital bed where he's dying of cancer. Another is he may already be dead. Who knows? What happens if Deng Xiaoping should die or should announce his resignation soon?
I think that whatever he has cobbled together now, whatever new leadership will emerge from this, is going to be a relatively transitory leadership. The divisions within the party, within the military, within the government are now very, very deep. And I think that when Deng does die or fully retire, that everything once again will come up for grabs and we may see a renewed round of leadership turmoil.
If you had to point to one key to watch from here on out, what would it be?
I think that the key to watch now is how deep, how wide, and how harsh the purge and the repression go. We know there's going to be some dismissals from the party, some crackdown on intellectuals and on student leaders, but we still have to wait and see how wide-ranging and how strict, how harsh, how even brutal that may be.
Do you think things get worse still or begin to get better now?
I don't see them, frankly, getting better in the near future. They could get a lot worse. Hopefully, the situation will now stabilize. There will be no further outbreaks of violence. The repression will be relatively limited. But I think there is still a very, very great danger that there will be continued sporadic outbursts of protests, demonstrations, possibly violence, not only in Peking itself, but in other major cities across the country as well.
Dr. Harding, thank you.
Very welcome.
From world leaders to rank-and-file citizens, protests around the world today against the Beijing bloodletting in Hong Kong. 100,000 demonstrators rallied against the Chinese government as union leaders called for a general strike there on Wednesday. Hong Kong is a British-ruled territory which will be handed back to China by the British if it goes on schedule in 1997. Chinese students abroad were quick to show their horror at the brutal crackdown as well. Gary Reeves reports on the angry reaction in this country.
In big cities and small ones all over the United States, Chinese students took their anger to the streets, protesting the violence in China by exercising their American freedom of speech.
People will always remember it. All the people in the world, you should remember it.
I don't understand them. I don't understand why they do so terrible thing.
The voices were heard at the Chinese embassy in Washington, but the wreath-bearing protesters were shut out. In Columbus, the voices were quiet, the people in mourning. But the thousands who marched in Chicago carried signs calling for revenge, and they heard the voices of those who had talked to friends in Beijing. They heard the tales of tragedy.
He saw in his own eye that a tank ran over a 6-year-old girl, and his mother went crazy right immediately.
The students here had enjoyed watching democracy come to their country. Few were prepared to see it crushed.
Those students are unarmed, and they are patriotic, and what they want is only a democracy and freedom, but the government used troops and killed them.
And it's not just random protest. The students are organized. A list of demands prepared in New York has been faxed across the country and repeated at the various rallies. And their demands are reaching their intended targets, the senators and congressmen of the United States.
Many of the students here say had they been home in Beijing, they would have been in the square when the army rolled in. Now that the voices there have been silenced, many here feel it is their duty to fill the void.
We'll fight to the end until the corrupted, the damn regime will just wipe it out.
Chinese students in New York have called for a hunger strike in the U.S. starting tomorrow, just the beginning of what promises to be a long season of discontent. Gary Reeves, CBS News, Chicago.
Two Americans watching China's pro-democracy, pro-reform movement from a distance, and to those, such as your reporter, who met the students and their supporters firsthand, face-to-face. Beijing's iron fist crackdown comes as a harsh reminder of the oft-times terrible price of freedom. Some are willing to die to achieve it. Others are willing to kill to prevent it. China's aging regime has the tanks and guns. The protesters have only an idea, freedom. But that's an idea potent enough to do again what it has done so many times before, to change history. Through the smoke and the destruction and the death of today, that is the core of what is happening in the still developing China story. Now, later in this broadcast, Mike Wallace will have more on another of today's major stories, the death of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, Mike being one of the few journalists in the world ever to actually interview the Ayatollah. So stay here with us. 60 Minutes will continue in a moment.